my channel. My name is Martine, and if you are new here, I do videos on Vedic astrology mainly, but also with some tropical insights, and I focus on both relationship and natal astrology. And if you like this video and you would like to see more content from me, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to my channel. Also consider clicking the notifications bell if you want to see when I will post a new video. Also, if you are interested in a private reading, I do readings in astrology on a variety of topics ranging from relationship readings to career to transits for 2-3 years, or solar return charts or predictions for 1 year, etc. You are free to email me at the email address that I will leave in the video description, and I can send you a pricing list and reading options and any other details that you might require. Also, I want to mention that I have started membership options on this channel, and the short of it, just to give you the short perks that you will get if you choose to join the membership section, you will get 1 extra video per month for each membership stage or tier. So for the first tier, you will get 1 extra video per month. For the second tier, you will get 2 extra videos per month, so you will have access to level 1 and level 2 videos. And for level 3 or third tier, you will get 3 extra videos per month. The level 1 and level 3 videos are going to be on a variety of topics, so basically anything related to astrology, but it will be content that is not shown on my regular usual videos, right? So this is members only exclusive content, and it can range from, tips and tricks on how to read a horoscope to, I haven't done this yet, but I plan on doing maybe members only astrological synastry for famous couples, for instance, or the analysis of famous people's horoscopes, but then I can also get into divisional charts, etc., etc. So all kinds of things. The level 1 or second tier of membership options is especially related to synastry astrology topics, meaning relationship-oriented astrology. So this could be things like how to discover which kind of partner archetype is right for you according to your horoscope, or it could be, again, different characteristics, whether you're going to have a good marriage according to your horoscope or a less than stellar marriage. But you can find more concrete examples in the lists that you will find in the video description, because I have added the playlists where you can already see all the videos that I have posted in each members section. So yeah, you can see what videos you will have access to from the ones that I have already done. But I will continue to post, like I said, 1 extra video per month for each level of membership. And in addition to that, in the members only section, you will have access to members only polls, and you will also have priority when it comes to getting your comments replied to on my channel. And you will also have stickers that basically show up next to your username that show that you are a member, and a couple of exclusive emojis. All right, so that's pretty much all the perks that you can have as a member on my channel. If you're curious, you can check the video description for more details as well, or you can click the join button under any of my videos to also see the prices, because the prices will be shown in your local currency. All right, in addition to the members only section, I also have a tarot channel, and I post there semi-regularly, and I will be linking the tarot channel in the video description as well as in the pinned comment. It's called Martine's Tarot. So if you are curious about tarot, if you're into it, maybe check out my channel, maybe subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening to this intro. And now I'm going to get straight into today's topic. Hello and welcome to my channel. Welcome to another video from me. So today's topic is going to be on something that, again, I have been meaning to talk about for a very long time, have not gotten the chance to until now, and although there are like probably at least 50 different videos that I really had in mind to work on. My time is really, really sparse right now these days, and so I have to focus on things that are more time efficient for the time being. And yeah, this is why I'm going to talk about this topic, because this is not something that really requires a lot of research, because I pretty much have everything I want to say in my mind already. I did try to look for examples of famous people. I only found one, as far as I remember. I'm pretty sure that, well, let me rephrase that. I didn't just find one, I found many, but I found one famous person that I can remember off the top of my head right now that has this placement. And I do remember finding a bunch of, potentially a few more famous people. There's an actor that I remember looking at. Pretty sure James Marsters also has this placement, but I would have to check again. And I know that there were some other famous people that I looked at. But anyway, before I get into it, it doesn't really matter, because to be fair, I don't have like extensive examples to show you, but it's something that I have noticed again through empirical observation over pretty much the past decade, roughly, maybe less than a decade, but since I've gotten into Darakaraka, it has been at least 2-3 years since I got heavily into Darakarakas. Shit, maybe longer than that, like probably since before 2020. But anyway, let me not get too much into details. But there's this thing that actually hit me only within the past year or so about Sun Darakaraka, especially about men with Sun Darakaraka, and the particular challenges that they have to face in relationships, and why a lot of the times they are frustrated in relationships and their partners end up being quite frustrated in relationships. And it has to do with the differences between people's biological needs in a relationship, or more specifically, women's biological needs in a relationship versus women's spiritual needs. And the same thing applies to men. I have talked about this topic and my views with respect to relationships and how you could look at a person from a spiritual side, and especially when it comes to gender in particular, you can look at it from a spiritual side. You can look at it from the perspective of a social construct, which it definitely is to some extent. And then last but not least, there's also the biological aspect, which is whether you're pretty much born with XX or XY chromosomes, which determine your biological gender. And basically, the way that I see it, there are 3 different levels of gender, and the third one is the one that you can see from astrology, in the sense that, not that you can 100% determine, oh, this person is masculine and this person is feminine. In fact, most people, according to astrology, and people who are really into it, they already know this, are a combination of energies that, when they are looked at from the social perspective of what is considered to be normal for the social definition of a woman and the social definition of a man, they can come across as more masculine or more feminine. But I talked about the fact so in that video, I really went in depth on a rant about this. So I'm going to try to link the video in the description. Basically, it's called My Views on Gender or something, or What Astrology Taught Me About Gender. I still stand by pretty much everything I said in that video. Even though I haven't listened to it since then, I know that I stand, because I largely remember what I talked about. And in fact, not only did I not change my opinion, but over the years, I just saw more and more evidence to pretty much reinforce the same observations, and even, notice some new ones, get some new observations, make some new observations, like this one that I'm going to talk about right now, which is about particular challenges, but it comes from, that topic that I talked about, the gender issue. And before I keep, how should I put it, like going roundabout in circles talking about how I'm going to talk about the subject. Let me get straight into it. So the short of this is men with sun in Darakaraka, sun is Darakaraka. And again, I have talked about this in that video as well. I'm pretty sure I did mention this at least briefly. Or it was maybe another video where I talked about the fact that people who have Darakarakas, or who have not just their Darakaraka, but the spouse archetype, right? If the spouse archetype indicators in their horoscope are not conventional according to society, they tend to suffer more in relationships, and their partners tend to suffer more in relationships. And what I talked about is, for instance, specifically about, not necessarily like specifically about sun as Darakaraka, but I did talk about this difference between masculine and feminine indicators, and how society can basically ruin, to some extent, ruin good relationships because it has this very narrow view with respect to gender roles and what the man has to do in a relationship and what the woman has to do in a relationship. But then there's also a purely biological aspect, and I've talked about my views on that in multiple videos, including the videos that I did with respect to women's needs and why, natality is going down and all that. And the biological aspect of women's needs, for instance, and men's needs for that matter, are pretty much, to a large extent, and I mean 99%, not changeable through sheer human willpower. So they're just a product of evolutionary biology, and if people basically stray from their biological needs, the more the body suffers, right? The more people stray from what they actually need, the more they suffer. And I think it's also, and I talked about this again in those videos, leading to mental illness, right? To a large extent, because mental illness, just like any other illness, is a symptom of the fact that humans are just living in a way that is not natural for them. And again, I don't mean for any of this, because I know anything you say can be taken out of context and used against you, and I'm definitely not anti-feminist. And in fact, I talked about this in multiple videos, especially the ones that I did on women's needs, that I think, in my opinion, one of the biggest gaslights, and I would say even forms of psychological abuse, because that's what gaslighting is, that is used collectively against women today, is this idea that somehow because women have received equal rights, that it means they have somehow signed off their right to have their biological needs met in a relationship, which is complete bullshit. Feminism was never about that. Never have any feminists in the early movement said that, oh, well, the reason why we want equal rights is so that we can have sex like men with multiple partners, or now that we have equal rights, it means that we no longer need marriage or something like that. There's literally nothing like that in the second wave of feminism, but men over the decades have been very clever in using and weaponizing women's rights against women's best interests, and have, somehow pressured women into accepting this deal somehow of, well, you have equal rights now, so you don't have the right to ask for marriage before sex, right? Which is bullshit. But anyway, I totally digressed. This is going to be a very long introduction. I did digress, but I also think that this is important to mention because it feeds into why I wanted to talk about this topic. Because, and I'm sure that many of you can already can imagine what I'm about to say, that men who have sun as Darakaraka, and I've noticed this in particular with men who have sun as Darakaraka, straight men, and I should stress this, and straight women who have moon as Darakaraka. Okay? To some extent, this can also apply, of course, to people who have the moon or the sun as strong influences when it comes to the spouse archetype in other ways. Like, let's say a man who has the sun in the 7th house, or a woman who has the moon in the 7th house, right? to some extent. But in my experience, the Darakaraka is the most important one on a deep psychological level because, and I've talked about Darakarakas in depth in the series that I did where I went over each planet as Darakaraka, but the short version of what I was talking about in those videos as an introduction was the fact that the Darakaraka represents basically a blind spot in the person's psyche. So it represents qualities that we do not identify with to a large extent. Even when the Darakaraka is not necessarily in the lowest degrees of a sign. And again, I feel like I have to keep opening parentheses in parentheses because they're important to look at, okay? Because astrology is not just, I don't know, like counting oranges and potatoes or something. You have to kind of have an overview of everything at the same time in order to get the big picture, right? But the parenthesis that I was going to open was about this concept in Vedic astrology. It has some term from in Hindi, I'm pretty sure, but I don't remember all the terms. But it is a thing. It is in traditional Vedic astrology. There is the idea that the lower the degree of a planet is, the more inexperienced the planet is in that energy, if you will, or the planet somehow is not comfortable, right? It hasn't mastered the energy of that sign. It's kind of like, if you look at a planet that, let's say, it's in the first 5 degrees of a sign versus a planet that is in the last 5 degrees of a sign, you're definitely gonna see a difference there, because it's kind of like the difference between, let's say, I don't know, detective, right, that is in their first 3 months on the job ever in this profession, so that's the planet in the first 5 degrees, versus a detective that has been working at this job for 20 years, right? So both of them can call themselves detectives technically if they have the qualification and that's in their job description. But the one that has 20 years of experience has seen pretty much, maybe they haven't seen it all, but they've seen a lot, right? With respect to what that job entails, and they know their environment. They probably move with a certain confidence in their field. Whereas a detective that has only just gotten their first job and they're in the first 3 months or 6 months at the job, they're probably not going to be that confident. They're still kind of getting their footing. They're still learning the ropes, maybe. So this is kind of the difference between a planet that is in a lower degree versus a planet that is in a more advanced degree of the same sign. And if you take this into account and at the same time add the fact that by definition the Darakaraka is the planet with the lowest degree in the natal chart, it kind of becomes an obvious conclusion to say that the Darakaraka represents a part of our psyche that we're not really fully owning, right? That we're not really fully comfortable in, because we haven't really experienced that sign. And now, there are, of course, degrees to which this happens, because some person can have Darakaraka in 15 degrees of a sign, right? So maybe that Darakaraka is a little bit more advanced. Another person could have Darakaraka, like I said, in the first degrees of a sign. So that Darakaraka, again, is kind of like that rookie detective that is not really confident in what they're doing. They may have good theoretical preparation, but they're not really sure of themselves, and they lack a lot of the expertise that comes with a lot of experience, right? As far as I've seen, most of the times, okay, the Darakaraka is a planet in the first 10 degrees of a sign, or at least in the first 10, 15 degrees. I personally have never seen a horoscope where all the planets were past 20 degrees of all signs. I'm sure that they exist, I just haven't seen any. But even in the event where that is the case, right? So all the natal planets in this person's horoscope are past the 20 degrees of a sign, the Darakaraka is still the one with the lowest degree. So it still represents the part of you that you are least aware of, that you are less likely to take ownership over, right? That you are least likely to identify with. In other words, if you were to draw a parallel between astrology and psychology, as far as I've noticed, again, empirical observation, the Darakaraka basically shows a blind spot in the psyche. So it shows things that we don't even see about ourselves. We don't really, even if we do have some of those inherent qualities that are represented by the Darakaraka, we don't identify with them. We don't see ourselves that way. So I've talked about, for instance, when I did the description for Venus's Darakaraka, how often you see that women who are very good looking, who have Venus's Darakaraka, tend to be completely oblivious to the fact that they're good looking, or they never see themselves as good looking as other people see them. At best, they learn to react to the way that other people see them, and they kind of, learn to strategize their attractiveness, but they themselves really deep down have a hard time seeing themselves as beautiful women, because they don't identify with that energy of the beauty, the beautiful, seductive, whatever, which is shown by Venus, right? Now, the reason I said that, of course, there are always degrees to which this is going to happen is because, of course, you always have to look at the full chart. So a person, for instance, could have Venus's Darakaraka, which would indicate that they don't really see themselves as a beautiful woman, but maybe they also have that Venus in the first house. In which case, they're more likely to be self-aware of their attractiveness. They're more likely to be accepting of their physical appearance, to be at peace with the way that they look, right? To really own it, because it becomes, even though it is also the Darakaraka, so to a large extent, it represents what they expect from a partner, it's also in their first house, so it's the house of self-identification, right? An example like this is Angelina Jolie, actually. As far as I remember, I think she had Venus's Darakaraka. So this was just an example to illustrate what I mean. And so if you were to make an analogy, because I use the Venus here, I use a different planet, but if you were to make an analogy here, I think you could kind of understand why Sun as Darakaraka becomes a problem for men. Because, and this is why I said, as far as I've noticed, the main problems arise with Sun as Darakaraka in a straight man's horoscope and Moon as Darakaraka in a straight woman's horoscope. And the reason these become problematic is because of social expectations to some extent, but also biological needs. And I'm going to break it down now after a long introduction. Now, as you know from the theory, Darakaraka represents what you expect from a partner, what you look for in a partner, because these are parts of yourself that you have disowned, that you don't really identify with. And of course, there will be, like I said, degrees to which this happens. To some extent, it also depends on the age of the person. Because in the first part of life, we are more likely to act unconsciously, to not be self-aware. So we are more likely to disassociate from the Darakaraka even more, right? In the first half of life, like up until the age of, 30, 35, 40. So we're even more likely to play out our horoscopes exactly the way that they are, with all the good and the bad. Because we're more unconscious and we're less experienced in life, okay? And so, because the Sun is Darakaraka in a man's horoscope, it means that, number one, this kind of a man expects, a woman with what are viewed as traditionally masculine characteristics. Because the Sun represents, well, it's the father archetype. It's the patriarch archetype. Let's look at all the different things that the Sun represents, by the way. Let's just get it out of the way. Sun represents leadership ability, confidence. A healthy Sun is confident. So it's not arrogant. Confident means they know who they are. They know what their weaknesses are. They know what their strengths are. They know how to make the most of what they have and what they don't have. Strategic thinking to some extent is the sun, but most importantly, rational thinking is the sun. Sun is reason, moon is emotion. So people who are very objective, who are rational, who are blunt, who tell it like it is, those are sun dominant. Usually. Of course, there are always degrees to which, meaning there's like a range depending on individual horoscopes and depending on that sun and how strong it is, etc., etc. But this is the bottom line. This is the general description. This is the baseline. And on the baseline, you have different nuances, right? This is the blank canvas of having sun as Darakaraka. And this is what a sun dominant person looks like, because that's what I was talking about. Let me not digress. So a sun dominant person, right, is going to be rational, objective, honest. Why are people that are sun dominant honest? Because the sun represents the king or the queen archetype. And traditionally, now if you think of the modern day queens and kings, these are basically very watered down, diluted versions of the kings and queens of ancient times. Not just ancient times, but like even in Middle Ages. And the king was seen as like the representative of God on earth. So it was their word, whatever they said went, and that was it. Nobody had the right to question it. This is why when you see sun dominant people, they tend to have this kind of bluntness, the vast majority of them, unless the sun is damaged in the horoscope, or unless they have other more dominant planets like Saturn, Rahu, whatever, they're more likely to be deceptive, or Venus, that is more likely to be diplomatic. But most of the times a sun dominant individual is going to be very blunt in the way that they express themselves. And they will say the kind of things that other people find outrageous. Even if they recognize that this person is accurate, they will be horrified. Like, oh, how can you say that? There will be the types that, like the children that yell, the emperor is naked in that story. Because they don't see the point. Like, the archetype of the king is having this consciousness that they don't see the point of lowering themselves, basically, by deception. So they will just speak whatever they think. They speak their mind, basically. This is like the pure, unadulterated sun energy. And aside from that, oftentimes sun-dominant individuals, especially when the sun is healthy, it's not damaged by malefics, it's pretty strong, etc. This shows a person who has a strong backbone. They have strong principles, and they're not bending left or right depending on, they're like the opposite of a narcissist. A narcissist, this is why I think I mentioned this in other videos, and I'm sorry if maybe, I don't know. I know some people are going to say that I have something personal against this or that placement because I say something negative. Whenever I say something negative about any placement, there are always people who are like, oh, you must, I don't know, have hated someone who had a prominent Saturn or had prominent Revati or... No. I'm talking about observation. Okay? And what I was going to say is, in my experience, and I think I mentioned this when the videos where I talked about narcissism, that people who are Rahu dominant, who are Saturn dominant, they tend to be most likely to be narcissistic because they do not really see the point, or they don't really, not that they don't see the point, but because of the archetypes that these planets come from, right? Saturn is like the misfortunate classes, so to speak. In traditional Vedic astrology, Saturn was the servants, the unfortunate, etc. So, and if you look at people who are Saturn dominant, for instance, as opposed to Sun, because these two are on opposite spectrums, Saturn dominant people will not think twice before using deception. In fact, they feel entitled to using deception because the mentality of Saturn is, I'm already discriminated against. I'm already at the bottom. What do you see? This is why I mentioned this repeatedly in multiple videos and the ones that I talked about in the Age of Aquarius, that what you see happening on a global scale now, the fight between totalitarianism / communism / socialism on the one hand, on the other hand, capitalism / monarchy / whatever forms it may take, regalism. This is the battle between Saturn and Sun. That's what it is. Sun is monarchy, It's what the Saturnians call privilege, right? So the idea that you inherit things from one generation to another. And the Saturnians are the ones who identify as underprivileged, who are downtrodden. And of course, whether this is accurate or not, both sides to some extent can be very emotional and not see things clearly. The truth is somewhere in the middle. But the bottom line is that because the Saturn archetype is connected to this feeling, and oftentimes people who are Saturn dominant actually experience this firsthand. You know, they experience discrimination due to social status or financial status or whatever, right? They come from a certain minority and that becomes a part of their early life experience and it brands them for life. And so they grow up wanting to overcome their initial social status. This is why Saturn is also connected to being a social climber, right? Very ambitious, very focused on achieving a certain amount of status, of success, etc. And it's not a bad thing, but it does become a bad thing when Saturnians resort to deception. But Sun, on the other hand, because of its initial archetype of, identifying as the king, you will see that the people who are Sun dominant will have this knee-jerk reaction to not give a F, about what other people think. And unfortunately, in today's world, they create a lot of enemies. Again, I don't want to get too political and stuff. I'm trying very hard not to get political, but I've long said this. I don't know if I said it on the channel before, but it's baffling to me how, people are so quick to vote for politicians who are just very good at playing on people's emotions and portraying themselves in a way that people find socially acceptable. And usually the politicians that are most popular in today's world and who tend to win elections are the ones who are the most neutral from every perspective. And people vote for them just because they say things like, oh, well, look, so-and-so seems calm and objective and all this shit. But a lot of them, if you look at their horoscopes, it's facepalm after facepalm. And you realize that the reason they are calm and objective is because, number one, they don't have a backbone, so nothing angers them. A person who doesn't have a sense of justice doesn't get pissed off by anything. For them, anything is fair as long as it gives them results. They don't understand the concept of a principle or morality. A lot of them are psychopaths who have no conscience, but people vote for them because, oh, look, they sound nice. Anyway, totally digressed. The bottom line is, the Sun energy, okay, is not just, connected to stuff like royalty and all this. It can be seen from that perspective, yes. But in a very pragmatic sense, right, down to earth sense, it represents, like I said, reason, principles. It represents pride, of course, which you might say, well, that kind of connects to confidence. Well, there's a difference between arrogance and pride. Pride is, again, comes from a healthy sense of pride, comes from confidence. So it comes from knowing who you are, knowing what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, being able to say you made a mistake when you made a mistake. Arrogance is having a cancerous ego that needs you to always be on top and needs you to always be right. People who would score high on a narcissistic trait, on narcissistic scale, would come across as arrogant, right? They would be arrogant as opposed to prideful. And of course, pride can also be a fault when you're taking it to extreme, because some people can become so prideful that they don't listen to anything. They think they're always right. Speaking of always right, this is another potential pitfall of the Sun dominant. They tend to become self-righteous. So while, again, a healthy Sun and the Sun dominant tend to be very focused on objectivity, they tend to be focused on the truth. But the problem is that if the Sun is damaged in the horoscope, or again, there are other planets that are kind of overshadowing the power of the Sun, this person could start to believe that they have a monopoly on the truth, right? So whatever they say or their version of the truth is the only version of the truth, and anyone who looks at things from a different perspective is definitely wrong. So that's self-righteousness, kind of thinking that only your opinion matters, and only your perspective matters, and that even though you are looking at things from an objective perspective or a limited perspective, you think that you own the ultimate objective view on any given situation. But going back to, masculinity. So I've said this in that video as well. This concept of what is masculine and what is feminine does not really exist on a spiritual plane. At least, again, this is my view. Obviously, I don't have any way to prove this beyond any reasonable doubt or something, because I don't know if it can be proven. Maybe at some point in my lifetime, it will be proven that astrology is a thing, that it's accurate. But just based on empirical observation, this is how I see things. What you see through astrology, whatever is called the soul, if you will, because I think that's what you actually see through astrology, it's kind of like a signal. Think of it as a radio signal being played on a radio. The radio would be like the physical body. And this signal, right, which is described by your horoscope, it doesn't really care about what radio it's playing on. It just is. It just exists. The radio doesn't produce it. It comes from somewhere else. Where does it come from? Nobody knows. That is the question. But the bottom line is that it just is. It just exists in its pure form. And I've also mentioned this as an example to illustrate this, that you could have the same radio signal played on two different radios. One of them is pink and the other one is blue. It's not going to change the signal. But a person who, let's say, is completely ignorant about what radios are and how they function, they might look at these two things and think that they're fundamentally different. They'll say, well, the pink radio must be more feminine. Maybe this is a very weird analogy, but this is the best thing that I could come up with right now. In the sense that just because certain characteristics that a soul has are perceived according to the definition of society to be masculine, doesn't mean that they're masculine in some kind of higher universal measure. The soul just is what it is, and it wants what it wants. But the problem is, so like a woman, for instance, just like in the analogy with the pink radio and the blue radio, a woman, right, could have Sun in Aries, and a man could have Sun in Aries, and they will have the exact baseline of personality when it comes to their Sun placements. They will both be, energetic and adventurous and have a healthy sense of confidence, and they want to initiate things, and they, are probably going to be fond of physical activity. But whereas these personality traits are going to be seen as acceptable in a man from the eyes of society, through the eyes of society, when it comes to a woman, still, in today's world, it might raise some eyebrows. They will look at that woman and think, oh, she's not really a woman. Because, according to the definition of society, a woman should not want to be an initiator or to have a strong sense of adventure or whatever, etc., etc. Insert random characteristics associated to Sun and Aries here. You see what I mean? And there's this fundamental misconception. Even in today's world, I cannot believe it. Just like a few days ago, I was listening to this podcast from a psychologist. And there was this woman there, the interviewer, a woman in her 70s. She said something along the lines of, children are born blank slates. And you just write on top of them whatever you want. I think the whole topic of the podcast was about good parenting or some shit. I don't even know why I was listening to that. I mean, I guess because I was on some subconscious level looking to heal my childhood traumas and try to understand how my parents messed up. It's a constant work in progress, even though, well, I'm 37 now, so I'm still uncovering different nuances of how I didn't get my needs met as a kid. But anyway, it really shocked me that this woman said children are blank slates. I was like, are you effing kidding me? I can't believe that there are people, and again, I mentioned her age because it was probably due to the fact that she was over 70 that she said that. Because this was a very common mentality for most of human history, that kids are just, born as blank slates and society can just write on top of them whatever the fuck they want. Pardon my French. But to a large extent, you see misogynists using the same mentality, the same belief that kids are born as a blank slate to reinforce misogynistic behaviors. They're out there saying things like, well, little girls, as long as little girls are, brainwashed to believe that they can play with dolls all day and they get reinforcement and positive reinforcement and feedback for playing with dolls and baking cookies instead of, quote unquote, masculine activities, they're gonna become the perfect housewives that God intended them to be, or other such ignorant bullshit. And this is not at all what you will see if you study astrology. Even a little bit, even if you become a beginner, just a beginner, even if you get all the way down to your ankles in astrology, you will already see the fallacy of this bullshit. And you don't even have to know astrology, to be honest. All you have to do is actually look at kids who are 3-4 years old, and you'll see that each of them have different interests, different personalities, different tendencies already from the time that they're toddlers. I can tell you for myself, for instance, I was born with the tendency, for instance, I had a natural interest in water from the time that I was a kid, even though my sister hated water. My father was a swimmer, but I knew from the time that I was 4-5 years old. Actually, on the first day of school, I told my teacher I wanted to be a marine biologist. Nobody in my family that I knew at the time was a marine biologist. They weren't a biologist. I found out much later that my grandmother, who passed away when I was about 1 year and a half, was a biology teacher. So, and I've said this again, this actually confirms another thing that I mentioned on multiple videos, that I think astrology decides the genetics you inherit as well. Because I said this especially when I was talking about physical appearance. How else would you explain the fact that if you look at a horoscope, you can sort of determine the physical characteristics that a person is going to inherit? If there isn't some kind of a connection between your astrological horoscope and the genes that you will inherit from your parents. So I think in my case, it was a combination of my horoscope and my genetic inheritance that I was blindly unaware of. I was completely unaware of at the time. But anyway, again, digressing. Just using an example. Okay, so this idea that kids are a blank slate is nonsense. Everybody is born with a soul, and that soul has an agenda. Already from the time you are born, we are all kind of born like turtles heading for the sea. And the sea looks different for every person. One person is all about studying something. One person is all about artistic expression. Different people may have, again, multiple interests. Or they might develop multiple things at the same time. But the bottom line is that this soul, which gives your initial imprint and decides what you are heading towards, right? What kind of sea you are heading towards, already from the very first days of life, this is not something that a human being can change through sheer willpower. That's really an important thing that a lot of people don't accept, and I think astrology can definitely help shed some light on this whole subject and help people understand that the soul is a real thing. Call it a soul, call it a personality, whatever you want to call it the cloud of the brain or whatever. But the bottom line is that this soul, this is the one that has the Darakaraka, this is the one that has the Atmakaraka, this is the one that has its own specific needs. And it doesn't care about what society expects from it. It doesn't care what the body needs. That's the saddest part. And the reason I say this is because this is really the main topic of the video. A man, for instance, who has sun as Darakaraka will expect a woman to be like a father figure. And this is where the problems start to begin. Because even though on a soul level, so let me put it to you like this. If two people were just two thought forms, they didn't have a body, they didn't have a biology, they didn't have physical needs, they didn't have the need to eat, they didn't have the need to function in a society. If they were just like two fairies in a forest without a physical body, a man with sun as Darakaraka would have no problem finding a soulmate and being very happy. But in society, considering biological needs, and most specifically considering the fact that a woman's biological needs are to need a man to support her physically, to be like a protector and provider and everything, this is where the sun as Darakaraka in a man's horoscope starts to become problematic. Because these kinds of men, and don't get me wrong, they're not dumb, okay? Of course, I don't know all of them, so I don't know, maybe some of them are. But what I'm trying to say is that these men, they grow up in society, they see and they feel the pressures of society. They feel the pressures of act like a man, right? And all this stuff. And what you see happening with a lot of them is, in fact, understandably, many of them actually start to overcompensate for the fact that they don't really feel comfortable in that sun energy. And they overcompensate to the point where they really want to embody that sun energy. So they try to project a persona that is very sun dominant on the outside. And this creates even more confusion in relationships. I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that quite a few men that I have seen, even two of them that I met in real life who had sun as Darakaraka, are highly narcissistic. And I don't think it's a coincidence in the sense that these men, probably from young ages, especially one of them that I knew personally, they don't feel confident. They don't readily accept that sun energy, especially if that sun is further damaged in the natal chart, right? The sun is in the 7th house, it's in the 4th house, it's in the 12th house. It's in these houses where the sun is not comfortable because it doesn't receive strong support. The Digbala concept, like the directional strength, which is determined based on house placement. Then maybe it's debilitated, maybe it's in Libra. Right? So, if the sun is further weak and it's Darakaraka, these men don't really feel confident at all when they're growing up. But because of social pressures, because sometimes they might even be subjected to bullying, they learn to put on a facade of, screw the world. And sometimes they actually overemphasize by developing this hyper macho sort of attitude. And sometimes it even becomes like a lifelong struggle for them to, how should I put it, reclaim their masculinity, I guess, or issues surrounding masculinity become like a lifelong topic for them, things they have to work on consciously. Like they might have insecurities about how manly they are, about how not manly they are. And the confusion in relationships, this is the part that I really wanted to get to. Understandably, right? Because you can already imagine, especially if you're a woman, you can imagine where the confusion in relationships comes from. First and foremost, I want to mention this, ladies. Don't think for a second that men who have sun as Darakaraka are going to be walking around with pink tutus around their waist and blue eyeshadow and lipstick, unless they are drag queens. But a lot of the men that I've seen who have sun as Darakaraka, actually, because of that overcompensation factor, are really masculine on the surface, which creates even more confusion, because the women that they attract the most are going to be women who see them as very masculine. So they look at them from the outside and they think, oh, this is the big alpha male that I've always wanted, who is, take charge, who's confident, who, whatever, takes responsibility, is ready to protect his family with the cost of death and all that. And then they get into relationships with these men, and they realize fairly early in a relationship, maybe not too early, because again, these men can be very good at hiding, especially before they secured the relationship, so before marriage. But the longer they tend to be together, the more it becomes obvious that these men are not comfortable being in that manly position. And the longer they tend to be in relationships, the more they will start to lean on the woman. And a lot of the times you tend to see that these kinds of men actually attract and are attracted to women who, of course, are sun dominant. Because, well, there is that basic complementary energy. Again, if a woman who is sun dominant and a man who has sun as Darakaraka would just be thought forms like fairies in a forest, they could live happily ever after. But the problem is that when you superimpose on the soul frequency or whatever the hell you want to call it, whatever the astrological horoscope describes, you can call it a soul, a personality, individuality, whatever makes a person who they are. When you superimpose biological needs on top of this, a lot of frustrations arise. Because women, even when they are sun dominant, and this is a fundamental problem for women as well. This is also why moon as Darakaraka is a serious problem. I'm going to talk about this in another video. And to some extent, sun as Atmakaraka is a problem for women as well. Atmakaraka being the planet with the highest degree. Because a woman with a sun as Atmakaraka, her destiny is very sun-oriented. So it's all about developing herself, her individuality, her authenticity. And again, when you look at it from the eyes of society, she's gonna get a lot of shit for that. Because, society doesn't like women who are self-obsessed. Who, spend their whole lives being self-motivated, focused on self-expression, focused on being themselves, etc. Taking on leadership positions, that's another thing, because the sun is kind of like leading. Ideally, the sun is leading by example. And so, aside from that, let me not digress too much. Because the man who has sun as Darakaraka attracts the sun-dominant women, even the most confident, self-absorbed, tough, how should I put it, competent women, the most sun-dominant women out there, eventually, and pretty early on in the relationship, start to be very frustrated with a man who has sun as Darakaraka. Because what they soon realize is that he starts to delegate everything to her. Because these men, with a few exceptions, again, there are exceptions depending on what else is going on in the horoscope. But these men, because they don't feel comfortable with that sun energy, first and foremost, what they will tend to lack is a sense of initiation. They're not going to be take charge. They get into relationships and they very soon delegate all the responsibilities of the relationship and family life to the wife. And so oftentimes the women who end up in these relationships tend to feel swamped with the tasks that they have to take care of. Because oftentimes they will have to not just work, but they will also have to do all of the child rearing. Anytime there's something wrong, the tap is leaking, the car breaks down, a lot of the times these men will not naturally take the initiative to solve the problem. They will expect the wife to call the mechanic. Or they will be like, oh, honey, you do that. You fix the tap. And this is I realize it's a very grim, sort of depiction, especially if you're a woman and you're listening to this. But I feel like women should be warned, number one, and I think that men need to be self-aware. I'm going to get more into that towards the end. But this is the bottom line, and this is because these men, especially early on in life, even more so, they're really not comfortable with that sun energy. And I'm going to take it a step further here. I don't think I talked about this in that other video, in those other videos where I talked about each planet as Darakaraka. But again, based on empirical observation, I think I've come to the conclusion, I'm almost 100% sure that this is the way it is, that people who have Sun as Darakaraka somehow lacked a father figure. Or the father, it's kind of like similar, if you will, to having Sun conjunct Ketu or Ketu aspecting the Sun. Because, and this is a conclusion that I have come to not just by observing the horoscopes of many people who have these placements, but also when you think about the psychology, or it's kind of like thinking about a bridge between psychology and astrology on the other hand. Because, okay, astrology tells us that Darakaraka, this is what I learned from traditional Vedic astrology. So the stuff that I talked about, you know, the sun not being developed, sorry, the Darakaraka showing parts of ourselves that are blind spots, that's something that I personally came up with, okay, by kind of looking into astrology and psychology at the same time, and again, analyzing a lot of horoscopes. The traditional description from Vedic astrology just says that Darakaraka represents what you look for in a partner. But then if you study psychology, you know that a lot of the times people project qualities that they disown in themselves onto the romantic partner that they look for. And now if you take it a step further and you ask the question, well, why is it that a person, for instance, does not identify with their sun energy? Well, a rational explanation would be that the father was somehow lacking. The fathering that this person got was lacking. So, and a lot of the times, again, by checking examples, horoscopes of people, I found it to be true. In the sense that this person who has Sun as Darakaraka felt like they didn't really have much of a father figure. And why that happened, again, you would be able to see that by looking more in depth at the horoscope. But really there's some kind of a lacking there. So the father maybe was too busy, didn't pay enough attention to the child. Maybe didn't even see couldn't even bother to really, let's say, spend time with the child to get to know them, to understand what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. Because I talked about this in the other videos where I talked about psychology and childhood and all this stuff. That the reason why a healthy sun in a horoscope, again, bridging psychology with astrology, the reason why a healthy sun shows a healthy sense of self-confidence is because the people who have a strong sun tend to have healthy father figures. And this is where you see the correlation between astrology and psychology, right? Because in psychology, you know, according to studies, that people who have a solid father figure, irrespective of gender, tend to have a solid sense of self-confidence. And it's the same thing. There's like a constant correlation, a constant kind of dance happening. You know, there's a correlation, not a dance, because it's not something that's happening between astrology and psychology. It's just two different perspectives of looking at the same thing. But the thing is, astrology gives you insights into things that psychology doesn't even touch upon. Again, let me not digress too much. But this is the bottom line. Psychologically, this is what happens. So the man who has a Sun Darakaraka has not really had a strong father figure. And just like a man who, let's say, has Sun with conjunct Ketu, well, not just, it's a different thing. Not exactly. Again, could be also like the way that a damaged Sun. So I made a different video where I talked about men with daddy issues. But I don't think it's exactly the same thing. Again, depending on horoscopes, of course, you could also have Sun as Darakaraka conjunct Ketus, in which case the father was definitely perceived as absent, irrespective of whether they were physically there or not. But if Sun is Darakaraka, It means that this person just wanted more fathering, wanted that solid son archetype of someone who was dependable, someone who handled crisis situations, someone who was there to protect them, to protect the family, who was reliable, who was always there with an answer, with good advice. That's the sun archetype. That's a healthy sun archetype. So the person who has this sun Darakaraka lacked in this department. And just as it happens with pretty much every unmet childhood need, they get dumped onto potential future partners. All right. Now, this is the psychology. These are the mechanisms that happen, and believe me, I have seen them a lot. Okay. One example that I've seen actually, it's easy to look at for examples of this, of men with sun as Darakaraka, because they tend to come across as emasculated in relationships, one way or another. Now, of course, depends on how well they mask it, depends on, who the spouse is, how much the spouse is willing to go along with the masking. But if you look at people who have sun as Darakaraka, men in particular, oftentimes you will tend to see these cases with men who marry quote unquote strong women. And these strong women, quote unquote, are basically sun dominant women who look bossy. So you will often look at couples where the woman knows exactly what she wants. And this is the part where I didn't even get into this, right? The part, not fully. I kind of touched upon it. But what happens to women in these relationships? Let me finish the idea first. But yeah, you can look at cases of couples where you see that the husband or the boyfriend is sometimes kind of becomes like a yes man, yes dear, whatever you say dear, that kind of thing. And I think feminism, to some extent, again, as much as I agree with the basic principles of feminism, has really confused a lot of people, right? Because feminism has gotten to the point where people ignore biological realities. They know it's no longer acceptable for women to say, yes, I want to have a career, but of course I would also want to have a man that I can rely on in crisis situations. Because that's basic biology. Women get pregnant, they're more vulnerable. Of course they need a man that they can rely on. And the problem is with these women who end up in relationships with these men is that they don't feel taken care of, which is catastrophic because that's the main thing that women need in relationships. Literally, the main thing from a biological perspective, all women need security. They need to feel that they have a man they can rely on, they can trust with their own lives, that they can rely on in crisis situations, that this guy, if she calls him, he will drop anything and everything to be by her side. This is what a woman needs from a biological perspective. And this is rooted in biology. It's rooted in the fact that women are more vulnerable, that they're physically weaker, that they die in childbirth, they risk dying in childbirth. And this is what a woman needs to feel comfortable in a relationship. And see, this is the inherent conflict between the soul and the body. Because a woman can be sun dominant, but she still needs a man that she can rely on, which creates a lot of problems. And feminism, again, adds more confusion because now there are a lot of men in today's world who are taking feminism word for word, and they're saying stuff like, oh, sure, I would love to have a feminist wife or girlfriend. And then they marry a quote-unquote strong woman, and they delegate all the stuff that he can't be bothered to do on her. And she is tired, exhausted, overworked, and ultimately feels alone and abandoned because the man has basically just dumped all his problems on her and left her to fend for herself. So that's horribly unsatisfying for a woman. Even a woman who is strong and independent, and who has, because again, the woman could be sun dominant, so she could, have a strong sense of purpose, has strong principles, maybe she can handle herself better than the average woman. But that does not change her biology. That doesn't change the fact that she also needs a man to make her feel protected and that she can rely on. And this is where all the drama starts for these kinds of relationships where a man has sun as Darakaraka. And oftentimes, if you look at their relationships and the relationship patterns, it's a lot of misery, even when these men, on the surface, come across as very successful, very desirable. Some of them, they're good looking, they're wealthy, and yet their relationships are a mess because they keep repeating the same unhealthy patterns where they fail to realize that a woman has very specific biological needs that have to be met. And if they marry or if they date women that are strong and expect these women to always take the initiative, to always handle everything themselves, basically, depending on the situation, a man with this placement could become so passive that he is constantly expecting the woman to lead him in everything. And what happens is these women feel almost like they're turned into parental figures, like they're becoming a mother, And it's not a turn on for the women in the situation. Now, on the positive, and this is how a lot of these men attract sun dominant women in the first place, is that these men tend to be, at least to some extent, accepting of a woman's personality and individuality. So, unlike the average misogynist of the day or of history in general, these men actually tend to like women who are proactive, who, again, display that sun dominant energy, right? They're handling business, they're self-motivated, they know what they want, they go after it. So women who basically display a lot of these like so-called masculine characteristics are going to be naturally attractive to these men. And so the women in these situations, they feel initially accepted, especially since it's very difficult for a woman who has a strong personality to be accepted anywhere in today's world and throughout history, but even in today's world, right? This is why initially these women, they tend to be very happy with a man like this initially, because they think, wow, this is a man who accepts me for who I am. Look, I don't have to change. I don't have to censor myself. I can drink and cuss like a sailor. I'm exaggerating because it's not like all sun dominant women do that. But you know what I'm talking about, right? So, because a lot of these women who have strong personalities, they might have dated men or they may have been attracted to men who made them feel like they were too much, that they were over the top, that they had too much pride, too much ego, too much anything, that they were too masculine. And then they come across a man like this who has sun as Darakaraka, who makes them feel accepted for who they are. And so initially, it looks like a match made in heaven. Until time progresses, and like I said, it starts to become more and more a situation where the man relies on the woman. The woman is kind of, if you want to see kind of I'm sorry to say this if I'm offending any fans, but if you want to see kind of a caricature of a sun Darakaraka man, think of Jon Snow from Game of Thrones. You know how his main saying throughout that show was, "You will always be my queen." This is exactly the energy of a sun Darakaraka. Oh my god, I paused and looked for his horoscope. I looked for the horoscope of Kid Harington, and he doesn't have sun as Darakaraka, but he does have sun conjunct Darakaraka, which is like the next best thing. I guess that's why he was so convincing in that role. And look, I'm not trying to, by the way, I don't want to sound offensive. Okay? Really. I'm making these videos just like all the other, well, I'm making this video just like all the other videos because I would like people to learn from my observations and to become more self-aware and understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how to improve their life, really. And a famous example that I was going to talk about is Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. And I think, you know how I got the idea to check his horoscope? Once that whole well, there were multiple rumors coming through about him and his wife. There was that rumor that his wife was actually a man. I don't know what to say about that, but I actually watched a video that showed some pretty amazing evidence. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to suggest, by the way, that the men who have this placement are gay. It could be, of course. But this is the part where, again, it becomes tricky to fulfill both the soul's needs and the biological needs. Because also, by the way, I forgot to mention this, from a man's perspective, the men who are in these relationships, speaking of Emmanuel Macron, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around from one. You can tell that my ADHD medication is wearing off because it has been probably 12 hours since I took it. Anyway, but I was talking about Emmanuel Macron, and I was about to say that there was that thing that came through the press that she had hit him in public, something like that, and there were all these rumors that even before that, you know, there were all these rumors that, you know, he was under her control, that he was, you know, bossed around by his wife. And that was really, I have to admit, what got me thinking, oh, maybe this guy has sun as Darakaraka. And yeah, he actually does. Now, why did I not just why did I think about it, but what I was going to say is about the men in these relationships and why they're not happy is because even though on a spiritual level, right, they are attracted to women who have strong personalities, who display those sun qualities that they look for. And again, I should have mentioned this from the beginning, but to some extent this can, just like in the Kit Harington example, can also apply to men who have sun aspecting the Darakaraka. So according to Vedic astrology, the sun can only make two aspects, conjunction and opposition. Those are the ones to look for, but I would say especially with the conjunction, not so much the opposition. Because the opposition, again, tends to fall into the opposite territory, which means that you are more likely to identify with the sun qualities. But maybe even with the opposition, you would see the same traits to some extent. But yeah, having this sun Darakaraka for a man oftentimes turns into them over time feeling emasculated. So in the beginning, they are very attracted to women who have strong personalities. But these women start to become frustrated and bitter and angry in relationships because as time progresses, and again, I always mention this, so much depends on the rest of the horoscope. There will be various degrees of this happening, depending on what they have in the horoscope and synastry, etc. But especially, actually, again, I'm going to hold this thought because I want to talk about something after. But as time progresses, these women get tired, they get bitter because everything gets delegated to them. They have to face all challenges by themselves. They have to constantly take all the initiatives, right? Whenever anything is wrong with the family, they become the first responder. Not only that, but a lot of the times these men with sun is Darakaraka, they themselves rely a lot on the wife, on the woman, on the partner. In the sense that I've seen cases, believe me, that people who know people that I've known by, I don't know, how should I put it, second degree acquaintances or something. And the women, right, and these men, by the way, these are men with ranks in the military. And the wife, if you hear the wife's complaints, they're going to sound something like, I have to do everything myself. And this is why it's important to know astrology, again, even from the perspective of a woman, because believe me, a lot of these men, because they're so good at overcompensating, come across as very masculine, very macho, very manly men, and women go gaga for them, you know, oh, what a man, what a man, what a money good man, you know, like that song. And they end up in relationships with them and they're like, holy shit, this guy, he's all over the place, you know, I have to pick him up, have to mop him off the floor. Because he, oftentimes, they need a firm hand to hold them together, to guide them. They want a woman who's kind of like a rock that they can depend on. And I've even seen situations where, you know, women in these relationships have boyfriends or partners who constantly call them and ask them about everything. You know, those kinds of guys who are like, I'm at the supermarket, what should I buy? Or they'll call them at work, like, I can't find this, I can't find that, where did you put this? And it's not like a, you know, once a month thing. It's on a regular basis. Because these men, and again, because this is an important part that I did mention in the beginning, but I didn't really expand on it. Sun is reason. This is an important part. Men who have Sun as Darakaraka are not particularly rational. Even when these men have professions that are shit, some of them, they could have a PhD in physics, right? Or they could be mathematics professors that have published research papers in university. But when it comes to the way that they live their day-to-day life, they're very illogical. They're very emotional, depending on what else is dominant in their horoscope, of course. Not necessarily that they're completely illogical. If maybe they have, I don't know, Mercury prominently placed, they're going to be more logical, more or less. But if the Sun is the Darakaraka, Sun, first and foremost, represents reason, objectivity, and the capacity to make decisions to some extent. Because this is, again, the king archetype. The king makes decisions. That's leadership. So all of these things that the Sun stands for will tend to not be developed in this man's psyche. They don't readily take on this role. And another aspect that is very important is that Sun represents, last but not least, fatherhood. And these men, again, I'm going to try not to be negative, they don't tend to be good fathers. And it's not one of those, again, a lot depends on what else is going on. First of all, it depends on how self-aware they are. Are they aware of what they're doing? Have they gone to therapy? Are they working on their stuff? But this is one of those placements that unfortunately does not naturally lend itself to a particularly self-aware individual. By the very definition of the Sun is Darakaraka, and because it shows a kind of eclipse of reason, these people will tend to not be particularly focused on reasoning. Reasoning, objectivity are not going to be things they're naturally focused on. So they may not even be interested in analyzing themselves. They will act on instinct. They will act on emotions. That will act on based on whatever is more dominant in their horoscope. Okay? And this can also show, by the way, when the Sun is the Darakaraka, they tend to not be good at making decisions. They need someone else to make decisions for them. They need someone else to advise them. Which, again, is not always a bad thing. But if this is a constant, right, from a woman's perspective, it just shows that she can't rely on him. Or, if they fall into overcompensation, they're very confidently make bad decisions that impact not just them, but their families and their wives. You know, these will be the kinds of men who will, I don't know, spend the half the pension fund that they have with their wives on a friend's business or some shit without having any kind of proof that this business is going to produce a return on investment. Or they will gamble away their salary when they have 2 kids or 3 kids to feed, or stuff like that. They will make irrational decisions. And back to the topic of fatherhood, sadly, not to be entirely negative, because it's not entirely their fault, but by virtue of the fact that the Sun being Darakaraka tends to show that they themselves did not have a solid, healthy father figure. They will tend to not have good examples of fathering. And so that consequently will turn into they themselves not really being healthy father figures. And again, a lot of this has to be analyzed from the perspective of the rest of the horoscope, because there could be various degrees of this. Depending on what else is going on, it could be that there will be more or less good fathers if there's something else going on. But still, on a fundamental level, if the sun is the Darakaraka, they will probably not be able to instill a lot of the same things that they felt were lacking from their childhood. So things like, building up a strong sense of confidence in their children, spending time with them, accepting them as individuals, and seeing them for who they are, as opposed to projecting on them or just, seeing them as just kids. Kid number one, kid number two. Or like narcissists do, they project all the things they hate onto the scapegoat child, and they project all the things they like about themselves onto the golden child. But neither of them really gets to be themselves. They just get projected upon. Yeah, so there could be various things like this happening, basically. So what is the solution to this? Because it sounds very long and complicated. Well, one solution, and again, I have to admit, I have not actually seen this, but just based on what I know from astrological theory, I would say that this would be a healthy solution. Would be for these men to date women whose horoscopes naturally develop their sun qualities, stimulate their sun qualities. Kind of like, I don't know, stimulating skin to grow after a graft or something. And what do I mean by that? I mean women, for instance, who have their Mars in a conjunction or a trine to their sun. That's a naturally supportive energy. A woman who has her moon in a trine or conjunction to the man's sun. Because if a woman has her moon in a trine or conjunction to the man's sun, she will naturally kind of take a supportive role. Doesn't mean that she will, quit her life and become a housewife. But she's more likely to accept the man to take the lead, or like gently encourage him to take the lead. And that's really what these men actually need. They kind of need a lot of gentle encouragement, which unfortunately they tend not to get because of their, well, first of all, because of all the things that I've expressed up until this point in this video, right? Because of societal pressures, because they themselves construct a mask in order to function in society. That's another thing with these, this is true for anyone in today's world, but especially with men who, have these like insecurities about their masculinity and whatnot. These men are even more prone than the average man to shut down and not talk about their problems, because they will be very afraid that anything they say will somehow make people see them as less masculine or something. Like they have to continuously keep a stiff upper lip, which in turn just makes them kind of spiral down into feeling lonely and isolated and like nobody understands them. Back to other aspects that a woman should have. To some extent, of course, it could be healthy to have these things in the composite chart, right? So if they're dating a woman, if they have healthy sun aspects to the composite sun, that would also be helpful. But also when it comes to, aspects from a woman's horoscope to a man's horoscope, for her planets to kind of support his sun naturally, that would be not an 100% remedy to the problem, but it would help a lot because it would naturally support him in developing that sun leadership role. And in a way that is natural, right? Doesn't feel forced, and it's also not a problem for the woman most of the times. So, healthy aspects, like supportive aspects from the Mars to the Sun, from Jupiter to the Sun, right? Jupiter is the great benefic. So with Jupiter, even with Mars, actually, a single-sided aspect from her Mars or her Jupiter to the man's Sun would be helpful. So single-sided means Jupiter aspects the 5th and the 9th and the 7th placement from where it sits. And of course, the strongest would be the conjunction. Same thing, well, not same thing, but with a conjunction, also with Mars. So Mars conjunct or trine to some extent. I also take the trine into account, even though it's tropical, because again, I've just noticed it through empirical observation that it works. And I've mentioned this in other videos, when you really think about the meaning behind an aspect, it makes perfect sense that the trine is a valid aspect. I'm not going to get into this whole theory because I've already digressed way off topic many times in this video. But yeah, so a woman who has Mars aspecting the man's sun, Jupiter aspecting the man's sun, Saturn not so much, because Saturn is a diminishing aspect. So if a man already has insecurities and a woman has her Saturn in hard aspect to his sun, a trine or a sextile wouldn't be that much of a problem. But a square, even a conjunction or an opposition, that would make matters even worse. More likely to make the man even more inhibited and, less confident in his sun qualities. But yeah, Jupiter's fifth aspect, ninth aspect, like I was saying. And also, Venus as well. Like, Venus conjunct the sun, because Venus is about love. So Venus supporting the sun just means that the man would feel accepted in being himself. So it helps. The moon, again, supportive. Moon and sun are very important because, again, it's about that masculine feminine polarity. So if a woman has her moon conjunct a man's sun, trine a man's sun, to a lesser extent also the sextile, but to a much lesser extent, because the sextile is not really a particularly strong aspect. But these aspects, these supportive soft aspects, would naturally encourage the man to take a protective role with respect to this woman. And she would naturally kind of become more of a submissive in a way, but in the sense that she would be more comfortable with letting him take the lead, at least part of the time. If, on the other hand, again, the woman has her moon square the man's sun or opposite the man's sun, again, this could also make matters worse. Same thing with an inconjunction or a quincunx, meaning signs that have nothing in common. So the woman, let's say, has moon in Taurus and the man has sun in Sagittarius. That's not a good combination, because there's no natural support there from the moon to the sun. The worst of them would be the square or the opposition, where again the man would be made to feel inadequate in this relationship, because the woman will feel frustrated with the fact that he doesn't lead her the way that she likes her to be led, because that's what a square or an opposition would show. A very bad aspect to have would be a woman's Ketu aspecting the man's sun. So this is a bad aspect to have in general, but even more so if the man in question has a damaged sun in his natal horoscope, because it would make him feel even more emasculated and even faster in the relationship. To some extent, though, a woman's Rahu aspecting a man's sun can be good, although it's not ideal, because Rahu is about deception, it's about projection, and with Rahu there could be an opposite effect, which, even though it's not entirely bad, especially when a person has, confidence problems, it's not exactly a healthy support, because with Rahu, similarly to Jupiter hard aspects, the woman might tend to overestimate the man. So it's kind of like, because remember that Rahu is the planet of illusions and Maya. Even though according to traditional Vedic astrology it's seen as a positive thing when a woman's Rahu is conjunct a man's sun, I would argue it's not great, okay? It's not as bad as Ketu, but it's not great in the sense that over time the man can develop a very inflated ego, and that's not a healthy development, especially for someone who already doesn't really have a strong sense of self. Because that's another thing, the sun can show a sense of self, of how you identify. So people with sun as Darakaraka can also have a hard time defining themselves in a self-standing way, defining their sense of identity and all that. Okay, this is pretty much what I wanted to say, I think. I don't think I missed anything. But one final thing that I want to say about this topic of, what kind of women, or rather, what kind of aspects you should look for in synastry in order to offset a lot of the negative effects of Sun as Darakaraka in a man's horoscope, is that men who have this Sun, you will notice, especially in the first half of life, when again they're very unconscious, they will actually not even be attracted to women that they would have these naturally supportive aspects with, because if they have these aspects, right, they will instinctively feel. So, like, for instance, if they're in a relationship with a woman whose moon is conjunct their Sun, they will instinctively feel, oh, this woman wants me to be the man in the relationship. She wants me to take the lead, to lead her. And they're, especially early on in life, they may not feel comfortable in that position. Or even if they do feel comfortable, because again, they follow social expectations, they're kind of like, just like in the original argument that I used, the original analogy, they're kind of like that rookie detective on their first job. They don't really know what they're doing, but they're putting on a facade and they're hoping to fake it till they make it, right? But the problem is, they won't really feel comfortable with women who have like supportive aspects to their Sun, because they will naturally feel, like I said, they will instinctively feel like, oh, this woman expects me to be, to be the man, to be the leader, and they're not comfortable with that. So the reason I say this is that, to a large extent, ultimately, it boils down to self-awareness. And the men who have these placements, they should be aware of the fact that, even though, of course, it's perfectly natural from a spiritual perspective to like what you like, at the end of the day, you can't control what you like. But you also have to bear in mind the fact that women have certain gender-specific needs biologically, and think about how you can best meet those needs while at the same time get your own needs met. And of course, you would have to have good communication in relationships for that, I would say. All right, this is pretty much what I wanted to say. Only a short video of only like an hour and a bit. So thank you very much if you have listened to this very long rant. And I hope that I have explained everything that I wanted to talk about, because, like I said, I've been mulling over this topic for a long time. And I also want to do a video for women who have moon as Darakaraka, because that's a whole different can of worms that has to be delved into, also from the gender perspective. And I'm sure that many of you can imagine what I'm about to say just by listening to this video. But I'm going to do a video on that either way at some point in the future. But this has been it. I hope you have enjoyed it. As usual, if you have, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to my channel, click on the notifications bell if you want to be notified when I post a new video. Also, if you want to find out more about the membership section, check out the join button. You can see the membership options and the prices in local currencies. And if you're interested in a private reading in astrology, check out the video description. You can email me at the email address that I will link in the video description. And I can send you a pricing list, reading options, details, etc. And I mention this all the time, I do not spam people, so don't be nervous that if you're going to send me an email, I'm going to memorize it and send you newsletters or something. I don't do that. So yes, if you're curious, you can just drop me an email. I will respond with the information you asked for. And aside from that, of course, I also have a tarot channel called Martine's Tarot. I will be linking it in the video description. And if you are curious about tarot, if you're interested, go ahead and check it out. Maybe subscribe to that channel as well. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!
So, hello again. This is me continuing my ideas. I just realized that there were some points I forgot to make about this. I got sidetracked. I apologize. So, yeah, here I am completing my take on the issues that men will face if they have Sun as Darakaraka. And also, to some extent, if they have Sun aspecting the Darakaraka by conjunction or opposition. One thing that I forgot to mention, maybe it was somehow implied, but I did not say it directly, is that basically a problem is that these men tend to put their girlfriends or their wives, well, their romantic partners basically, on a pedestal, right? So they're looking for women that they can admire. So kind of like just like in that analogy that I used with Jon Snow and Daenerys, the characters from Game of Thrones. And I also mentioned that Kid Harington ironically also has Sun conjunct his Darakaraka. Um, just like the character Jon Snow in that show, they basically look for women that they can lead, that they can follow, almost like a queen, right? Um, And there is an aspect of this that I didn't really cover. And I did talk about the biological problems and the fact that a lot of the times these women end up feeling like, they're the ones who are constantly put in positions where they have to make all the decisions in the relationships. And once there are children involved, they might have to, make all the decisions when it comes to the children. And that is definitely a huge part of why women in these relationships tend to become dissatisfied, they tend to become resentful, and ultimately, as they get resentful, they start to become bitter and nagging or looking for arguments. And also, they tend to emasculate the man over time. So, in the sense that oftentimes it can even lead to like outward disrespect towards the man, like they just start to criticize him or treat him like a child, or and again, in some situations, even when maybe the woman to some extent is justified to be resentful, they end up just making matters worse a lot of the times, as far as I noticed. Now, again, I always mention this, that a lot depends on what is going on in synastry as well, because I'm not trying to say, by the way, that when a man has Sun as Darakaraka, it's like everything that's going on, everything that's negative in the relationship is going to be his fault. Of course not. Because in addition to him having Sun as Darakaraka, there can be other problems, other difficult aspects in synastry that are going to complicate matters. But no matter what else is going on in synastry, this will be the baseline, basically, when it comes to a woman's biological needs. The fundamental conclusion is that a lot of the times these women really don't feel like they have their needs met on a biological level, in the sense that they don't have a man that really takes on that protector and provider role that women need, basically on a basic instinctive level, in order to feel safe and protected and relaxed and all that stuff. Now, there is another aspect that's happening. Sometimes it could be, more of the biological thing going on in relationships. Sometimes it could be this other second scenario, which is more psychological. And as I was saying, it's coming from the fact that men tend to put these women that they're dating on a pedestal. And the problem here is that, number one, obviously, if you put your partner on a pedestal, chances are that you're going to start to become disappointed, because any person, no matter how wonderful they are, they're only human. And as time progresses in the relationship, their faults, their flaws, right, they're going to surface more and more. And so a lot of the times you actually see these men in relationships who become increasingly disappointed because they put their romantic partners on, like I said, a pedestal, like, and they hold them to an impossible standard, right? Let's not also get into the fact that a lot of the times these men are also very demanding. And to some extent, that's true definitely with women who have Sun as Darakaraka. But with, now that I mentioned women who have Sun as Darakaraka, because of biological differences. Again, I'm mentioning this now rather late in the video, but I think you probably figured it out that I'm talking about heterosexual relationships. I did mention it at some point, actually, I remember that. Because in heterosexual relationships, things like biology, things like gender norms, right, that are exist as pressures from society will affect the relationship a great deal, right? And so when a woman has sun as Darakaraka, that's actually seen as the ideal according to misogynistic, patriarchal, mentalities. In the sense that, a woman with sun as Darakaraka is going to want a man that she can look up to, that is going to be like a king in the relationship, right? A man who's going to lead her, that she can follow. Um, I also mentioned this at some point. It's rather more of a problem if a woman has sun as Atmakaraka, but again, I won't get into that here. Maybe I'll make a separate video. But yes, there is this added issue that complicates things whereby these men really idealize their partners. And I did mention this in another part of the video as well, that I have noticed that this placement does also show up maybe more frequently than average. Now, it would be difficult for me to say, but I have come across quite a few examples. So I would say intuitively, it's very likely that it's more than average that these men tend to become narcissistic. And the reason that is like I said, is because they tend to overcompensate a lot of the times. Now, I'm not justifying anything, and I'm definitely not telling any woman that she has to take shit from a man who has this placement because, oh, poor him, he's always the victim. Definitely not saying that at all, but I'm just trying to explain how a lot of them actually end up scoring high on narcissistic traits because deep down they're really very insecure. And again, a lot of this will also depend on what else is going on in the horoscope. So whether the sun is more or less damaged in the rest of the horoscope. So if the sun is in a healthy placement, let's say the sun is in Aries, it's in the 10th house, it's not aspected by malefics, maybe on the contrary, it's aspected by Jupiter, right, which is a great benefic, then chances are that this man is going to still have some very basic core masculine traits. Maybe they were lucky to still have, to some extent, a good male role model who was a father figure growing up, so they learned a lot of positive masculine traits. But if the sun is further damaged, so the sun is conjunct malefics, right, it's with Ketu, it's with Rahu, it's aspected to some extent, also aspected by Mars, by Saturn, and if on top of that, especially, it's in debilitation, it's in, 7th house, 4th house, some of these houses where the sun is really not happy to begin with, it would show an even stronger feeling from the native that they did not have a solid father figure, or maybe they sometimes, again, depending on specific circumstances, they may have felt that their father didn't really care about them or really didn't take enough time to get to know them, to build them up. Or it could be issues where they felt betrayed by the father, like maybe the mother was abusive, the father didn't protect them. Whatever the situation was, somehow the native that has this placement, and again, I'm mainly talking about men in this video that have this placement, they're going to seek to get their needs met, the needs that should have been met through a father figure when they were growing up, through their romantic partner. And I know it sounds very weird, and yeah, Freud would have definitely left the building, but this is what I've seen through a lot of empirical observation, and I'm sure that once you stop to look around, you will see plenty of the same patterns that I have looked at. And ironically, actually, I only had the idea to look into this matter more when I discovered like that quite a few actors, I don't remember exactly how many, but I know I looked at multiple horoscopes, but I do remember James Marsters, who played Spike on Buffy. So I watched Buffy, the original one, like I think last year or something, and so I went through a phase where I was very interested in the show and the characters. I did a lot of, astrological stalking, basically. And I remember looking at his horoscope, and at first, initially when I looked at his horoscope, I was expecting to see a strong sun. To be fair, his time of birth is not known, but I think anyone who's into astrology, knowing what the sun stands for, would naturally tend to assume that someone who gets into a profession like acting, for instance, or any kind of profession that is requiring them to take a center stage position, right, where people look at them a lot and they're basically exposed in many ways and whatever, you would expect these people to have a very strong sun energy, right? But ironically, and James Marsters and a bunch of other actors that I looked at did not have a particularly well. James Marsters actually, as an example, he did have a strong sun by placement, as far as I remember. I don't even remember exactly which nakshatra or which sign, but a pretty strong sun by sign at least. Yet it showed up as Darakaraka, which was not what I expected. Again, I did not expect it to be the planet with the lowest degree. But when you actually stop to think about it more in depth, it makes a lot of sense that actually a person who works as an actor would be more likely to have Sun as Darakaraka as opposed to Atmakaraka. Because when you think about it, in order to be an actor, you kind of have to embody other characters. So you have to be someone who maybe not necessarily doesn't have a strong sense of self, although that's relative, that's debatable. Maybe some of them really don't have a strong sense of self, but it's not necessarily a strong sense of self, but you have to somehow be able to detach from yourself, right? Not be that focused on figuring out who you are and what your authentic self is and all that, and instead be willing to embody other characters, right? And learn how to become someone else, which would actually show the fact that this person is not particularly attached to their sun energy. So whereas a person, for instance, who has sun is on Makaraka, I would say, again, depending on the rest of the horoscope, of course, but I would say a person who has sun is on Makaraka would find acting to be considerably more difficult because their purpose in life would be all about me, like developing their own sense of self, their own sense of identity, and kind of analyzing themselves and figuring out who they are, right? So it's a much more self absorbed sort of placement, if you will. And I don't mean this in a critical way because, again, some people, they are meant to develop their sun qualities. And it's not like sun is just self absorption and egomaniacal behavior. It's also leadership capacity, again, developing a strong sense of confidence, etc., etc., etc. But yeah, this was something else that I wanted to mention, this tendency towards idealization. And again, of course, it's understood in a way that if as a woman you date a man who puts you on a pedestal, you also feel eventually uncomfortable, or you feel like you can't really be yourself, or this person actually doesn't really like you, they just like an image they created in their heads. And this also, by the way, kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that this placement, I think, oftentimes shows up in horoscopes of men who are also scoring high on narcissistic traits, because this over idealization is actually typical for narcissistic men, especially initially in the relationship. They look for partners that can somehow reflect positively on them. So they look for partners that make them feel good about themselves, so that they can look over to their partner and say, oh, this person is so amazing, they have achieved this and they've done that. And so they put them high on a pedestal as a way to gain from their reflection, if it were. I don't know if I'm expressing it um well, but it's in a different way than having arm candy, right? Again, it does depend on what else is the sun is doing in this horoscope. Sometimes it could be a combination of arm candy and something else, but usually when a man has sun as Darakaraka, it's not so much about whether they have the hottest girlfriend, but it's rather about having a high status girlfriend. So, because the sun, again, represents royalty. So, they will tend to go for women that even physically have a certain amount of class, or they have facial features that um, kind of suggests something, how should I put it? Noble, like a noble birth or something, people who look refined, etc. They tend to really care about not so much like just purely how hot, like I said, how sexy a woman is, because if a woman is just very attractive, that's a lot of Venus energy, right? But the sun energy is more about having a certain class about them, like not just in the way that they dress, the way they portray themselves, but also, like I said, through their actual physical features and sometimes even by their actual social status. So, this is why you actually see that these men go for women who are relatively successful a lot of the times. So, and even, which seems kind of a contradiction because, again, you would think, especially if they also score high on the narcissistic scale, it's kind of counterintuitive because you wouldn't think that, well, a man who's a typical narcissist, that they would go for a woman who, let's say, has a career, right? You would expect them to be 100% misogynistic and want to have a housewife, but that's not exactly true. They might think less of other women, but when it comes to the partners that they choose, they have to be able to, like I said, put them on a pedestal and, kind of show off the fact that they're the ones who married the queen, quote unquote. Okay, this is pretty much what I wanted to add, and I'm sorry for mixing the video up a little bit, but I just realized I forgot to talk about this, right? So, thank you for listening. If you have listened to the whole thing, thank you so much, because I know it has been roundabout, confusing, etc. And like I said, I will also be doing a video on women with moon as Darakaraka because that's also important to talk about. For now, I might be doing, of course, more videos in the future. But for now, these are the two that are very important, not just because of gender differences that have to deal with biology and social pressures, but also due to the fact that the sun connects to the father archetype and the moon connects to the mother archetype. So I think these two Darakarakas really kind of connect to psychology in the sense that there's the relationship between, they also show the relationship, they affect the relationship that the native had between them and their parent, right? So basically, men who have sun as Darakaraka, somehow the relationship with the father was lacking. Women who have moon as Darakaraka, the relationship with the mother was lacking, and somehow, and more specifically, lacking in a pretty much literal sense, in the sense that they felt they didn't get enough of that quality when they were growing up. So again, with sun as Darakaraka, they will have felt that they didn't have that strong masculine, protective, and provider sort of person who was a leader, who knew what to do in crisis situations, etc. And with moon as Darakaraka, the person lacked the nurturing, the love, the that feeling that the mother gives you of being the apple of her eye and all that. So they didn't get enough attention, etc. But yeah, I'm gonna talk about that more in another video, like I said. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you at my next video. Bye. Oh my god. I paused and looked for his horoscope. I looked for the horoscope of Kid Harington, and he doesn't have Sun as Darakaraka, but he does have Sun conjunct Darakaraka, which is like the next best thing. I guess that's why he was so convincing in that role. And look, I'm not trying to, by the way, I don't want to sound offensive. Okay? Really. I'm making these videos just like all the other, well, I'm making this video just like all the other videos because I would like people to learn from my observations and to become more self-aware and understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how to improve their life, really.